I guess first, I should say that this is not an aging study. Unlike most of the work that I'll present on this channel, this was one that was just a question about how memory function works in young, healthy people. This came out of some work that I had been sometimes involved in, sometimes, was just going on in my postdoc lab at the University of Oregon, where we'd been doing these inference tasks where we teach people some pieces of information and you're supposed to be able to derive some inference, something that connects the pieces of information that you learned but that we don't tell you directly. And what we'd found across a couple of different studies is that people were not great at this. That this inference ability wasn't that intuitive to people, and that they needed quite a bit of support in order to make those inferences. Starting my new own lab at UW-Milwaukee, I started to think a little bit about what kind of mindset might someone need to be in order to be better or more likely to make one of these inferences. I wonder if we tried to put people into kind of like a detective mode, made them play a little bit of Sherlock, would that make them more likely to make an inference? So when you think about what a detective has to do, they have to take all these clues that they might get from different people, from a crime scene itself, other sources of information, and they have to put it together and say, what does all of this point to? And maybe if people were asked to be in that detective mode, we might be able to boost their inference abilities. Another piece that comes out of that detective mindset is that making inferences isn't just a passive thing, that people aren't just given information and then, in their own minds, just have to sit there and make the inference. Oftentimes in real life, and especially if you're an investigator and in that investigative mindset, you should ask questions, right? You don't just have a suspect in front of you and say, tell me your whole life story and we'll see if anything pops out. You do ask some targeted questions to try and get to the information that you have in mind. So that was another piece that I wanted to add into this study. Okay, so the task in terms of the instructions is set. We're trying to induce this detective mindset. So we tell participants that they are a detective and that they're going to be trying to solve a crime. And what we're going to present them with is the current evidence. Now, the current evidence that we have for them is suspects, so people, where they were, scenes like bathroom, kitchen, library, etc., and then what objects were available to them at the time. So things like rope, lighter, hammer, etc. So they were all tools. Unbeknownst to the participant, there was also a structure to these associations. So we might have a person like Greg, they didn't really have names, but just for ease of explanation, who would be associated with the kitchen, and they were supposed to learn Greg and kitchen. There would also be another person who was also associated with that same location, so Sally and kitchen, as an example. Then you would find out that Greg is also associated with a certain object that was presumably in that location. So Greg and rope, for example. What we didn't tell them was whether Sally was also associated with the rope. That was the left out association that a participant might infer. And we had participants go through a number of different phases of the task. The first phase was the learning phase. So they would be shown a person at the top of the screen and either two scenes or two objects, and they had to pick which they thought belonged with that person, and then they would get feedback as to whether they were right or wrong. Ultimately, they get to quite high accuracy with these directly learned associations that we give them. So on average, they end up at about 90% accuracy on the ones that we're directly training them on. The other phases were what we call the study choice phase. So this is a critical phase in terms of testing how much people seek out information about potential inferences. So what we did is we showed them a screen with all of the faces that were shown in the study phase, and they picked one of those faces to learn more about, right? And then after they picked the face, then they were given the option to either learn or be shown the scene associated with that face or the object associated with that face. Now, If they were seeking to learn more about those inference associations or potentially confirm an inference that they'd made, they should choose the second face. So they should choose Sally, and then they should choose object, because it was the object that they never saw with Sally. They saw her with the scene, so the kitchen, but they never saw her with the rope. In addition to the study choice phase, they would also have a test phase where we would test them on those 3 associations they learned during the study phase, but then we would also test them on the left out person to object association, that is the inference association. So the first question is, did we actually boost generalization? After all of this detective framing, did people do really well at generalization? No, we did not solve that problem. Generalization, or this inference ability, was at about 60% on average, and that's even though people directly learned the training associations to about 90% accuracy on average. They were still only making these inferences at about 60% of the time. So that wasn't 100% successful. We'll definitely say that. Now, when we looked at that key study choice phase where they were able to decide to learn more about a particular person, we got a big surprise. That surprise was that people did not choose the inference association in any systematic, statistically significant way, more than we would expect by chance. Even weirder, they tended to choose instead the association that they had learned the best during the training phase. So what we saw when people went to make study choices is that they tended to reinforce knowledge that they already had, that was already there, rather than seeking new information or even to try and boost some studied information that they had learned slightly less well. This was all pretty puzzling to us, to say the least. We had a lot of kind of chuckles to ourselves about like, oh man, this explains students in my class. They are just studying the stuff they already know instead of trying to seek more information that would boost their knowledge. But we wanted to follow up and try to learn a little bit more about what might be going on. So we ran 2 more experiments that were pretty similar to the first and also pretty similar to each other with slight tweaks. And the one that I'll focus on that ended up being important across both experiments 2 and 3 is that we gave people more study choices. So in the first experiment, they only had 1 chance to pick a person and learn more about them. In study experiments 2 and 3, they had 4 choices. So they had 4 opportunities to learn about people. And a lot of the results were pretty similar to experiment 1. So participants still generalized or made inferences at about that 60% rate. And when we looked at just their first choice, when they were given that study choice phase, the first choice that they made, they still picked the thing that they had learned best during the study phase. So that was very consistent. But the interesting thing that we saw was after that first choice, they suddenly jumped up to choosing the inference association at significantly higher than chance rates. And that became their most likely choice. And that inference picking, if I can call it that, continued for the subsequent choices. So what were our takeaways? Well, 1, inferences and generalizations hard. That's not something that people do as intuitively as just rote learning of information. 2, that when people get to explore or proactively choose information to try and learn, they often will start by reinforcing familiar information. That feels comforting, that feels good. It feels good to have the positive reinforcement of already knowing the answer. But once people get beyond that, they really will start to explore and try to glean new information that might be available to them.